Well, good morning, friends. Today is November 11th, and as we've been meeting every single month with the purpose of having conversations that we believe are important conversations to drive really big businesses, the title of this whole mastermind was this idea of how do we make sure that we're on a path to a million, whether it's grossing a million or netting a million or not, or just being focused on truly owning a business. I believe that one of the things that I've been working on personally over the course of this year is being able to make better decisions. Ben Horowitz says that the key to a great CEO is being able to make a good decision when there are no good decisions to make. And at times, there's no good decision, right? There's no easy or good decision, and yet we have to make one. And oftentimes we make it, and we wonder if we made the right one. Sometimes we make it, and the decision itself confirms, yes, that was the right one. But because Ben Horowitz had said that in his book, The Hard, actually, is proof that it's never too far away. The Hard Thing About Hard Things. At the beginning of this year, I told our organizations that I believe that a huge competitive advantage for us was going to be becoming better decision makers, to make better decisions. And so over the course of the year, I have been doing some research and study and really just learning about great mental models. And there are literally hundreds of mental models. Anyone know what a mental model is? What's a mental model? How would you define that?
Like a thinking framework, Chris? Is that what you mean? So a method and a process that you walk through mentally?
Yeah, it is. It's a frame. That's a really, really great phrase. It's a framework by which I am going to make decisions. Now, here's why it's important as business owners. When there are decisions that need to be made quickly, when there are decisions that need to be made with emotion, without frameworks, then we make different decisions, or we make decisions differently every time we're faced with a different situation. And over time, especially when leading people, that becomes inconsistent and at times incongruent. When leaders make decisions without frameworks, they seem to show up differently at different points in the year, in the month, in the week, in the life. And yet decisions that, or leaders that make decisions on frameworks with mental models are incredibly congruent leaders. And at times, if that leader makes a decision, you think, well, that's a weird one. When you actually have a conversation with that leader and you ask them what they went through to make that decision, you'll see that they followed a framework. So as we think about this phrase or this word, mental model, that's what I want you to have in your mind. Today is going to be going through just a few key mental models that I believe are important for all of us to internalize and learn. Mental models, if you're making a note, ultimately by definition, they are how we understand the world. When things happen and we look around, we have these models to process through. Not only do they shape how we think and how we understand, but they also will begin to shape the connections and opportunities that we see in the situations we find ourselves in. Mental models are simply how we simplify complex situations. A mental model is basically this representation of how something works in our mind. Now, it's important that we don't form mental models which are not models, because those are just really strong opinions, and that's a danger too, especially with this group. We tend to show up with highly formed opinions, and so we're like, well, I don't believe that, I don't believe that, I don't believe that. And part of this research project was Adam Grant's book, which I've talked a lot about. I think I talked about it last month, Think Again. It is being willing to think differently about what we've believed for a really long time. I've had to do that a lot this year. Probably probably one of the guys that was the foremost thinkers on mental models, or at least had went out into the world and brought these mental models together, because they've been in existence for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. Many of the mental models were based on Stoic philosophy, for instance. But Charlie Munger said the first rule is that you can't really know anything if you just remember isolated facts and then try to call them back to mind. Right? The first rule is you can't really know anything if you just remember certain facts and then you try like, oh, this is a fact and this is a fact and this is a fact. And this is where framework comes in, Via. He said, if the facts don't hang together on a lattice work of theory, then you don't have them in a usable form. So mental models are sort of this framework that you piece together, that when you're presented with a decision, when you're presented with a problem as a leader, when you're presented with a challenge in business, we can go through these mental models and then say, well, based on how I think or see the world, this is the right decision to make. Charlie Munger wrote an essay, and it is countless pages. So I might send a link out actually to it. Leslie, just remind me, I'll get it to you. This is how I started researching mental models to begin with. I think it was called The Psychology of the Human. It's a fascinating essay, like is probably a 60, 70 page essay. So it's really a book. But I say essay so it'll convince you to read it. But he said in his essay, he said, the quality of your thinking depends on the models that are in your head. And the solution to any problem becomes more apparent when you can view it through more than one lens. So we're going to go through today 9 mental models, not one. We could literally spend an hour on each one, but then you'll have one lens, and that's not good enough. Like, it's important for us to have these have multiple mental models to sort of gauge our decision making and our thought process and our feelings through. As we go through them, some of you who I connect with regularly will like, oh, that's why you said that the other day, or oh, that's why you texted me that, or that's why you asked me that question, because I have been on this journey of internalizing these 9 mental models, the first 9. I have 147 more where that came from, by the way, but that's clearly another time to spend together. But these are the 9 that I believe are the most important. Now, I got these specific 9 from someone that I listen to and follow. His name is Shane Parrish. He has a podcast, and he actually wrote a book. He actually decided to go out and compile many of these mental models. The first group of mental models were the great mental models of history. So these are those 9. He has math mental models and physics mental models. Like, they're pretty cool. But today we're going to go through 9 mental models. Here's the other thing that they will do. Mental models remove blind spots, and we all have them. In life and business, the person with the fewest blind spots wins. And that's because when we remove them, it means that we see, we interact with, and we move closer to understanding reality. And for me, I come from a highly regimented, opinionated, stubborn upbringing. Without mental models, I will believe that I'm seeing things in reality because I've established my reality. These mental models have really challenged me to think differently. And I think as a group of leaders across our network, that is my goal, is to get us to think differently. And by thinking differently, we'll make better decisions. By making better decisions, we'll have better businesses. By having better businesses, we'll live better lives. So here's what's going to get in our way. I'm going to tell you this up front, right? So if you're taking notes, these are the 3 flaws that everyone has that gets in our way of really internalizing and building off the mental models. Flaw number 1 is perspective. We have a hard time seeing a system that we are in. Right? It's that I never get these trite expressions right, but it's like the forest from the trees, right? Or the trees from the forest. But anyway, we have a hard time seeing the system that we are in. That today, it applies to your business. You have a hard time seeing what's going right in your business. because you're in it. You have a hard time seeing what's going wrong in your business because you're in it. We have to be open to other perspectives if we want to understand the result of our actions. So flaw number one is actually our own perspective. Flaw number two is ego. We have too much invested in our opinions of ourselves. And that's not a bad thing. Like, I don't want us to imagine or picture, right, like someone that's highly ego driven, but all of us have ego. And what that really means is we are invested in our opinion of ourselves. Some of us need to improve our ego because our opinion of ourselves doesn't match how awesome you are. That's fair, but that is a problem too. And mental models will help us through that. Ego as a flaw creates an ignorance. And that ignorance oftentimes keeps us banging our head against a wall over and over and over again. So ego will prevent us from using these mental models. And the third thing, it's third, but I said two. The third thing that gets in our way is distance. Distance. And here's what that means. The further we are from the results of our decisions, the easier it is to keep our current view rather than update them. Now, we've all experienced, I'm just gonna, like, it's easier to take a step out of our own world and look at someone else for a minute, but we've all experienced someone making a decision and we think to ourselves, you have no idea the result of that decision. Like, you have no idea that the results or consequences of what you just decided to do or what you just said. And that's because you are too far away. You're too far away. Distance from the result of the decision we make, oftentimes we don't go through mental models to check whether or not it was the right decision. We just make them. To us, it kind of doesn't matter. The purer we are, or I'm sorry, the farther we are from the decision, the less pure of a decision that we'll make. We have to be careful, especially as our business grows, that if we lose touch with the results of our decisions, it'll be easier to make them without running those decisions through mental models. I've seen this happen. I've seen it happen again and again and again. I've seen it happen a lot even this year, where someone makes a decision, you realize that you didn't really think this one through, did you? You didn't pass that through these mental models to make sure it was the right one. So it's easier to fool ourselves that we are right at a high level than at the micro level. Because at the micro level, we see and feel the immediate consequences. And for those of us that lead people, or those of us have a big team or a small team, be careful. Like, we like to say, well, just do it this way, do it this way, do it this way. And they're thinking, you don't get it, do you? You don't really understand how much time that takes, or you don't really understand, like, that's not going to move the needle, but I'll keep doing it, but you don't. So distance, flaw number one. So keep these in the back of our mind as we go through these. Perspective. Flaw number two, ego. Flaw number three, distance. We all have those flaws, and that prevents us from really making decisions based on mental models. So mental model number one, the map is not the territory. So these are awesome to literally memorize, guys. So we'll say, and girls, that we will say that in our head, hey, the map is not the territory. This is what that means. The map of reality is not reality. Like, by nature of what a map is, it isn't reality. We wouldn't need a map. Like, we don't need a map of Oregon or Washington, right? Like if it was the full size, it's not reality. Even the best maps are imperfect. And that's because they're reductions of what they represent. A map can also be a snapshot of a point in time, representing something that no longer exists. It's important to keep in mind as we think through problems and make better decisions. So what does that mean? Well, we use maps every day. We have maps in our mind, and at times those maps need to be updated. So as I make a decision, I will ask myself, hey, or tell myself, the map is not the territory. Just because this got me here before, it doesn't mean that the off-ramp didn't change. Doesn't mean that there's not a new subdivision right here. Doesn't mean that it will always be the map. Maps guide us through complex territories, yes, but they are not reality. They are a version of it. We run into problems when our knowledge becomes the map rather than letting the underlying territory describe it. Let me use our industry as an example. There are some that want to keep doing what we've always done because we get the industry, we understand the industry. But more than ever, as leaders of your teams, more than ever, as if I'm going to raise my hand and say I'm going to be a leader in the industry, I better believe that the map is not the territory. The territory can change, right? The beach can erode, like the roads can change. We need to remember, number one, reality is the ultimate update. Thinking in reality is the ultimate update. Number two, consider the cartographer. Like, consider who drew that map or continues to draw that map. It's why leadership is important. Consider who drew your map that you are willing to follow. And number three, maps can influence territories. And if we're not careful and we just follow a map, we won't realize that map can lead us right off a cliff. The map is not the territory, is mental model number one. When we mistake the map for reality, we start to think we have all the answers, and nobody does. It's the importance of curiosity. If I was gonna boil this mental model down into one word, it's kind of the curiosity mental model. Like, if I believe that I'm making decisions without being curious of everything around me, I tell myself right now, hey, the map is not the territory. It doesn't matter if I've done it this way for a very long time. Mental model number two is the circle of competence. The circle of competence. This mental model, by definition, says when ego and not competence drives what we undertake, we have blind spots. If you know what you understand, you know where you have an edge over others. When you're honest about where your knowledge is lacking, you know where you are vulnerable and where you can improve. Understanding your circle of competence improves decision-making and outcomes. I have a lot of people that will call or text and say, hey, can you help me with this? And oftentimes I will need to say, by the way, more so since I've studied this mental model than before, I will need to say, I actually believe that might be outside my circle of competence, but let me figure this out. Let me find someone that can help. When we're in our circle of competence, that's not a bad thing. We have some brilliance there. Each of us actually have different circles of competence as well. It's what makes collaboration and networking so powerful. Within our circle of competence, we know exactly what we know and what we don't know. When we're in that circle, we can actually make decisions fairly quickly and relatively accurately, which means it's important for us to know what that competence is. So we're like, hey, this is my competence. I know this. I can make this decision. This is going to be good. But it's also wildly important to know when I'm stepping outside that circle of competence and know where information is obtainable or unattainable. What we need to remember is a circle of competence can't be built quickly. And as I look at some of the faces in the room, you guys want things done quickly. Like, you want it done yesterday. You want to believe that, hey, I'm going to jump in, I'm going to build this circle of competence, and I'm going to get frustrated if it doesn't happen in my time frame. That's not how circles of competence work. We don't become experienced or lifers overnight. Shane Parrish in his book tells a story of who would you go to as a tour guide? Someone that was born and grew up in a city, or someone that moved to a city to become a tour guide. Like, if I'm going to New York, I want someone that was there while the city transformed and knows the history and understand, as opposed to someone that said, hey, I learned the attractions. Like, the circle of competence is just as wildly different based on longevity within that circle. The other thing to remember is you can't operate as if the circle of competence is static. That once attained, it's attained for life, including what we're doing right now in our businesses. The world is dynamic. Knowledge gets updated, activities get updated, and so too must our circle. So as we're faced with decisions, this is the mental model. Hey, is this within my circle of competence? Do I feel competent in this topic, in this area, in this decision? If not, who is that I can engage with? There are 3 practices needed in order to build a circle of competence. Number 1, curiosity, the desire to learn. As I interview people, I will ask questions like, what was their favorite course in school? I'll ask them, and yes, you know, what's funny is I hate getting the question, but I ask it anyway. Hey, what was the last book that you read? I will look for signs that they're just curious. Do you do any online study or learning? I think about my a good friend, Sarita, right? Like she went back I don't know how old she is, nor would I say it out loud, but she went back to get her MBA at my age, let's just say. I think she's older, but at my age. Why? Because she's just wildly curious, like curiosity and the desire to learn. Number 2, 3 practices needed to build competence is monitoring. Monitoring. If we don't monitor, if we don't check in, if we're not tracking what we are doing within our circle of competence, we won't know if we're keeping it. We won't know if it's shrinking. We won't know if our circle of competence is growing. And the third thing, as we monitor, we need feedback. Many of you are here because you appreciate feedback. Like you'll call and say, hey, can I get your feedback? And you know, if you call me and ask me for feedback, like I'm going to give it, because I expect that you really want it. So our circle of competence shrinks or expands based on those 3 things: our curiosity, how we monitor that circle of competence, and feedback. We have to be willing to learn. We have to be able to monitor and track record what we're doing, and we have to solicit external feedback. I'll give you 2 examples of people in history that did this well, that was in the book. The first one was Queen Elizabeth I of England. She ascended the throne, and by the way, her reign was not assured. Like it was a tumultuous time in history between her father and her brother and her sister, and you've read the history books. It was a wild mess, and all of a sudden she's now queen. And the first thing she did, like there was political crisis, there was religious crisis, there was war, there was issues internally. It somehow sounds like our country, but what Elizabeth did first, she said, I knew that there were aspects of leading a country that were outside my center of competence. And so she went outside. Some people said, well, why are you going to the common man to get, well, she wanted perspective. She built what she called her Privy Council. It was her royal advisory board. And she didn't copy what people did before. She went out and cleaned house and got a brand new set of advisors. You know who else did that? Abraham Lincoln, right? He called them his team of rivals. In 1860, he put together a cabinet of all of his competitors. Can you imagine a president today going and saying, okay, like, let me build my cabinet. Who did I just run against? You're on my cabinet. Like, who was the opposing party? You're on my cabinet. Like, who would do that? But his perspective was this. Their circle of competence is definitely not mine. I want to expand my circle of competence. Charles Darwin is an interesting quote from an interesting man. He says, ignorance more often begets confidence than knowledge. Ignorance more often begets confidence than knowledge. So mental model number 2 is our circle of competence. Are we surrounding ourselves with people that have competence outside of ours? Are we engaging in relationship and conversation with them? Are we willing to figure out where our competence circle ends and where someone else's begins? Mental model number 3, first principle thinking. we've heard this a bit more lately. People say, oh, that's first principle thinking. That's first principle thinking. This is what it is. It's the third mental model. Ultimately, it's Socratic thinking, but the first principle thinking says this: first principles thinking is one of the best ways to reverse engineered complicated situations and unleash creative possibilities. Why? It's called reasoning from first principles. It's a tool to clarify complicated problems by separating them and their underlying ideas or facts from assumptions. Right? So it's really taking this problem like, hey, let's think about this first principle. Let's break it down to its simplest form. When we do that, what remains are the essentials of what our issues are. I've shared this with a few of you. Just a few days ago, I was listening to an interview with I love listening to female leaders that are CEOs and CMOs and CFOs, and I just think that their perspective. Right? It's not my perspective, so I like to listen to them to understand that perspective, right? And she was the CEO, I believe, of Nextdoor, who that's a company that hopes to go public here in the next maybe 6 months, 7 months, 9 months, 12 months. And she said that one thing that that has made her wildly successful in a leadership role across all the companies, like she is a career CEO, she was brought into Nextdoor to help build community and grow that company. And she said, I have a 5 why formula, 5 why. When I'm thinking about a problem or someone comes with me a problem, I will ask them why, right? Like, man, like I'm really struggling with taking a listing. Like, why? Why do you think that is? Well, I can't even get to the table. I can't get the appointment. Well, why aren't you getting at bats? Why don't you think you're going to get to the table? Like that's your second why. When you get the answer, go to your third why, go to your fourth why. And she said, you will boil down to first principle thinking by your fifth why. I'll tell you, I mean, I have a lot of problems, but when I break down my problems with 5 whys, like why is that the case? Well, why are you doing that? What you'll find that we've cluttered up a lot of our own thinking or our beliefs or what we think we should do or what we're not doing because we're not at first principle thinking. Socratic thinking, which is first principle thinking, is premised on we need to clarify our thinking and explain the origin of our ideas. What we'll realize is oftentimes the origin of our ideas are archaic. Like when we go all the way back to first principle thinking, we realize, oh, herein lies my issue. Here's the evidence of my problem. Here's some questions. If you're taking notes and want to write some questions, like how do I get to first principle thinking, Chris? Like here's some questions. Why do I think this? What exactly do I think? How do I know this is true? What if I thought the opposite? Then we begin looking for evidence. How can I back this up? What are the sources? Then we move to consider alternative perspectives. What might someone else think? How do I know I'm correct? Then we examine consequences. Well, what if I'm wrong? What are the consequences if I am wrong? And then I go back and question my original question. Why did I think that? Was I correct? What conclusions can I draw from this reasoning process? Socratic thinking is powerful. Now ask yourself, how many times do we do that when we're faced with a decision before our stress level goes up and our energy level goes up and our heartbeat goes up and our drama level goes up? First principle thinking. Mental model number 3. The map is not the territory. Number 1, got it, internalize it, ask ourselves, am I using that? Number 2, the circle of competence. Is this in my circle of competence? If not, why not? If not, whose is it in? If not, who can I get some feedback from? Mental model number 3, first principle thinking. Let me go back. Let me unpackage this. My 5 whys to get to first principle thinking. Number 4, Thought experiment. Many of us will like this one. Mental model number 4 says we need to run some thought experiments. Thought experiments can be defined as devices of the imagination used to investigate the nature of things, right? That's your definition. A lot of disciplines use thought experiment. Philosophy, thought experiment. Physics, thought experiment. They create these experiments to examine what can be known, like what is true. But in doing so, it is said that they open up new avenues for inquiry and exploration. Thought experiments are powerful because they help us learn from our mistakes and avoid future mistakes. They help us figure out what we really want and the best way to get there. So a thought experiment usually has a few steps. If we're going to run a thought experiment, we number one, we ask a question. Okay, so here's our question. Number two, we conduct some background research around that question. Number three, we construct a hypothesis. This sounds like science, by the way, and that's why it's called a thought experiment. We have a hypothesis, like I think this is actually true. Number four, we test it through some thought experiments. Now, I'm not getting a test tube here, guys, but what I'm doing is I am going to begin running through these thought experiments. I'm going to be experimenting with, well, what if I did it this way? Okay, what if I did it this way? What if I did it this way? I believe thought experiments would be great for what we say. What if I said this in this situation? What if I said this in this situation? What if I said this in this situation? As you're preparing for difficult conversations with team members or clients, run some thought experiments. A few of us would do incredibly well by doing that, myself included. So construct a hypothesis, run some thought experiments, analyze the outcomes, and draw some conclusions, right? It's still just an experiment. Then compare to your hypothesis and adjust accordingly. Thought experiments are easy. We just don't take the time to do them. We can use this to explore unrealized outcomes. Well, what if I make this move? What if I don't make this move? What if I make that decision? What if I don't make that decision? Thought experiments. Rerun that process as many times as we'd like to see. Now, keep in mind, some of us say, oh, I got this one down. I thought experiment myself to death. Well, then this is probably one you don't need to work on, but the other 8 will serve you well. Thought experiments for some, we need to improve. Others, sometimes be careful that you don't get stuck on this one mental model. Can you see where that could happen? Thought experiment, mental model number 5. Second order thinking. So we talked about first principles thinking, okay? As I'm faced with decisions, I'm going to go back to first principles. Then I'm going to move to second order thinking. And this is what this mental model says. Almost everybody can anticipate the immediate result of an action. And sometimes we think, okay, I'm going to do this. This is the action. This is what's going to happen. Am I okay with that? If I didn't do that, what would happen? Am I okay with that? Done. Right? And then we make a decision. We say, okay, Chris, thanks. I did a thought experiment. I went back to first principle thinking. Those are the 2 mental models I use. And herein lies my decision. Well, this is why these mental models are, what did Charlie Munger say? A lattice work by which we hang our decisions on. So they begin to create this beautiful lattice or framework of all of our decisions. Second order thinking says, hey, we need to go one step further. Second order thinking is thinking farther ahead and thinking holistically. It requires us not only to consider our actions and their immediate consequences, but the subsequent effects of those actions as well. Remember the flaw number 3 I shared that would get in the way. Second order thinking prevents this. Second order thinking doesn't happen when we're too distanced sometimes from the result. Sometimes we say, well, should that person be making decisions around a business that they're so detached from? well, we would just challenge their second order thinking. It doesn't mean that you can't run a business while not being in it every single day, but you better be good at second order thinking through the subsequent effects of decisions, especially if they're your own decision, because you'll get crucified if you did first order thinking for someone else and didn't think about the side consequences based on that decision you made without thinking through second order thinking. Failing to consider the second and third order effects can unleash disaster for your business. They gave an example in the book, and I think this is a very real example for many of us. We historically, right, we're in this country, we were farmers, like we produced food and that were crops and cattle. And so back in the day, they decided to start feeding our livestock antibiotics for decades, right? It made the meat safer, it made it cheaper, and that's because the cows were healthier, they gained weight faster, right? The first order decision around that antibiotic was farmers make more money because the cattle bulk up and gain weight, they'll spend less on food, making more meat. Like, this was a win. First order thinking. A lot of farmers made money. Second order thinking. Well, all of a sudden, bacteria began to survive antibiotic exposure and became more resistant to them. And the industry allowed mass numbers of drug-resistant bacteria to become part of our food chain. And then we wonder why we struggle with health. First order thinking, second order thinking. There was an economist from UC Santa Barbara. 1963 was back when, and this is where first order thinking and second order thinking really came into it's just sort of commonplace conversation. The economist was Garrett Hardin, and he proposed the first law of ecology, and that became this sort of snowball into second order thinking. He said this, his law was, you can never merely do one thing. Just remember that. You can never merely do one thing. Our decisions will affect others. And if we show up with second order thinking, we'll make better decisions. Next one, probabilistic thinking. This is going to work for the analytical ones in the room, for those that like math. They're like, well, I can get behind this one. This mental model says it's essentially trying to estimate, using tools of math and logic, the likelihood of any specific outcome coming to pass. Some of us, this is natural. Others, we need to do a little bit more of this. It's one of the best tools we have to improve the accuracy of our decisions. Shane Parrish wrote, in a world where each moment is determined by an infinitely complex set of factors, probabilistic thinking helps us identify the most likely outcomes. When we know them, our decisions can be more precise and effective. The purpose of mental models is to help us become better decision makers. So probabilistic thinking is important. So the future is inherently unpredictable, right? Because not all variables can be known, and even the smallest error imaginable, or the smallest error or variable could very quickly throw off your predictions. So we're never going to be 100% right? The best we can do, though, is estimate the future by generating realistic, useful probabilities. Here's what we need to be careful about if we're really trying to think logically and mathematically. They did countless studies on probabilistic thinking, and what they found was, as human beings, there is asymmetry in our ability to estimate the effects of decisions. And that's why you find people that tend to make a decision and end up in very similar situations. Let me give you the example that they studied. How often do you, this is a good one for realtors, by the way, how often do you leave your house and and you leave at a time, or your office, you leave at a time that you'll get to your appointment, and you say, hey, I'm going to give myself about 20% flex. I'm going to get there 20% early. How often you get there 20% early? Usually never, almost never. Now, how often do you leave on time and arrive 20% late? Listen, I have appointments with people all the time. Usually always they show up late. I'm okay. So don't feel bad if that was you this week. But that is because we have an asymmetry that affects our probabilistic thinking. Like, we just have this asymmetry that, oh, I'll leave at 3, I'll leave at 4, I'm going to leave at 2:30. We're always 20% late. We have those friends. Like, I have friends that come to dinner constantly. You know, like, it's 4 o'clock. No, they'll be here at 5:30. I'm not even showered by 4. Like, I'm not putting any food on at 4. I'm putting food on when they show up, because they're 60% late always. They skew towards a certain way, towards their probability. So as you go through probabilistic thinking, ask, what is your asymmetric skew? We all skew in a single direction. Like, listen, one's not better than the other. I'm kind of the opposite, and that's bad too. Like, I'm always early. Like, my wife is like, why are we even here? No one's here. We're too early. This is awkward. Like, that's an asymmetric skew in that specific category. But see, we have asymmetric skews in almost all of our decision. So probabilistic thinking causes us to really use some tools of math and logic and question the decisions we make and challenge our asymmetric skew. Fair? Next one of my favorites. It's inversion. This one actually reminds me a lot of Adam Grant's work, actually, which inversion is mentioned in that book. But inversion is a powerful tool to improve your thinking because it helps you identify and remove obstacles. The root of inversion, right, as a word, is invert, which means to upend or turn upside down. So as a thinking tool, it means approaching a situation from the opposite end of the natural starting point. Most of us tend to think about solving a problem one way, and it's forward, but inversion allows us to flip the problem around and think backwards about that problem. It can be more useful to start at the end, is what inversion states. So here is what inversion is about. It's about combining the ability to think forward and backwards, allowing us to see reality from multiple angles. There's 2 approaches to applying inversion. The first is start by assuming that what you're trying to prove is true, or start by trying to prove what you think is true is false, right? Hey, I believe this is true. Let me try to prove it. I believe this is true. Let me try to prove it wrong. Instead of thinking through the outcome as the way you're convinced that it will work, it's really hedging your bet. Another way that Shane described in his book is this. He said, avoiding stupidity is easier than seeking brilliance. Avoiding stupidity is easier than seeking brilliance. So here's an example. Vanguard index funds, right? Who invests in them? Yeah, lots of us, right? We, in fact, in the Win, Make, Give podcast, we've talked about Vanguard index funds. Why did they show up? First of all, they're fairly predictable, right? Jen, you raised your hand. If you've been invested in Vanguard index funds this year, you've done just fine, right? Why? Vanguard index funds was an example of inversion. Lots of people were trying to figure out, well, how do we beat the market? And instead of saying, how do we beat the market? Vanguard said, well, how do we minimize loss, right? How do we minimize loss? How do we reduce fees? Like, it came from that problem in a very different way. And so they developed index funds, right? They operate on the fact that accruing wealth has a lot to do with minimizing loss. So they hedged loss. And while they hedged loss, guess what happened? They created wealth. Inversion. There are a lot of our problems we are trying to solve going head on, as opposed to challenging ourselves to think about it in an opposite way. Avoiding stupidity is easier than seeking brilliance. The last two, Occam's razor. This is one that probably more than the others I see as if you're going to develop one, remember one, put one up on your wall. We'll send out these slides, by the way, afterwards, like we usually do, guys. So that if you want to use this for yourself, if you want to deliver this to your agents, feel free to. But Occam's razor says this: simpler explanations are more likely to be true than complicated ones. Man, I love this. I feel like my career has been built on me asking the question, is there not a simpler way? Like, I'm a simple human being. Can we do this in a simpler way? What's the simpler answer to this question? Like, that seems really complicated. What's a simpler way? And even then, I need to come back to this mental model and ask myself, did I build this or approach this with Occam's razor? Simpler explanations are more likely to be true than complicated one. It's the essence of Occam's razor. It's a classic principle of logic and problem solving. Instead of wasting your time trying to disprove complex scenarios, we can make decisions more confidently by basing them on an explanation that has the fewest moving parts. Don't complicate things. We often spend our time coming up with really complicated narratives to explain what we see around us. We sometimes do that with explaining interpersonal relationships. Oh, yeah, this is why this is happening. They feel this way, and they feel that way because they believe this, and they believe that because I said this, and I said that, but that was Occam's razor. Complexity takes work to unravel, manage, and understand. Eliminate it. We always need to prefer the simplest explanation with the fewest moving parts. Simplicity increases efficiency, for sure. Interestingly enough, when you have two competing explanations, the fewer variables that you can make a decision around, the more likely you are to be correct, just by nature of our inability to predict. Remember what we talked earlier about, our inability to predict in probabilistic thinking. Every time there's a variable that shows up in a step, it provides an opportunity for something to go wrong. That is in process, that is in business, but it's also in how we see the world and how we make decisions. Occam's razor: simpler explanations are more likely to be true than complicated ones. And lastly, Hanlon's razor. Hanlon's razor is the ninth mental model. And the world needs a little bit more of this one too. I love this one because it states that we should not attribute to malice that which is more easily explained by stupidity. We should not attribute to malice that which is more easily explained by stupidity. In a complex world, using this model allows us to avoid paranoia and ideology. By not assuming that bad results are the fault of a bad actor, we look for options instead of missing opportunities. It reminds us that people do make mistakes. It demands that we ask if there's another reasonable explanation for the events that have occurred. The explanation most likely to be right is the one that actually contains the least amount of intent. We can go deep here, can't we all? We are convinced that someone had bad intent, or someone was out to get us, or right. There are so many reasons that we overthink things. As we look at our friends on this call, be willing to call people out and say, Hanlon's razor, right? When someone leaves you that voicemail or sends you that text, and I can't believe this is happening, Hanlon's razor. Hanlon's razor states, I can see this happening in a lot of situations. Hanlon's razor states that we should not attribute to malice that which is more easily explained by stupidity. Daniel Kahneman, one of my favorite behavioral psychologists, proved many times over that we are deeply affected by available evidence, to such a degree that we're willing to make judgments that violate simple logic. All of us, right? We're deeply affected by available evidence such that we're willing to make judgments that violate simple logic. We have no problem or trouble packaging unrelated factors as they happen or occur in proximity to what we already believe, and we sort of add it on, right? We gather evidence. Oh, yes, and that's why that happened. I bet you they did that because of, and we're just packaging it in. And when we get there, all we have to say is Hanlon's razor. Hanlon's razor. When we see something we don't like happen, which seems wrong, we assume it's intentional. We assume that there's malice. If we do, Hanlon's razor says that's actually a self-centered approach. That actually infers or implies that you believe that someone's entire actions or thought process or decisions were based on you. Like you were at the center of what they were thinking and doing. And the reality is they were probably just thinking or doing something stupid. Like it has nothing to do with malice or you. Hanlon's razor. So as we think about these 9 mental models, anyone want to share in the last 5 to 10 minutes here, maybe one that jumps out at them, maybe one that they say, this is brilliant for us in business. What are your takeaways from any one of those? Go ahead and raise your hand and I'll be able to call on you. Who wants to share? We have a room full of sharers. Jen, you're good for a share.
I'll share. I figure if I'm going to log on to the call, I can at least participate, right? The Hanlon's razor, I think, gets me because I think that it's also that whole victim versus victorious mentality of like, do you assume that people are? It's that assumption piece and what happens when we assume, right? And so that people are out to get you or that people were meaning to do something mean. And so I think that one gets me because I think that I'm quick to read a text or a voicemail and assume it was bad or came from a bad place. And learning over the years that it's often stupidity or a tone of voice that was not meant to be there.
It's very real and you're not alone. Yeah, thanks for sharing. Janet?
Yeah, I mean, they're kind of hand in hand, but the Hanlon's razor I love because that's just applies in every relationship in your life, you know. Is there another explanation for this, you know? I just really like that one.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think one, it's the last one that we talked about, so it's fresh in our mind, but it may be the last one because it's the one we all need to remember. It'll definitely help our business decisions, but our interpersonal decisions and relationships for sure as well. Anyone else want to share a takeaway or a thought? Shauna?
I mostly just think this is a lot. It's I'm 9 whole things and I'm thinking the whole time, like, how on earth am I going to remember all this? But I feel like, you know, I guess when you take each model individually and you look at it, like you can get bogged down in details and it gets kind of overwhelming, but ultimately, like all of these are, can you keep it simple? Can you ask plenty of questions? Like, reverse engineer it, front engineer it, ask again, like write it down, measure it, think it forward, think the best of people, and come from curiosity. It's all kind of in a really similar theme or vein.
Donna, that's because as you go through it, even in 1 hour, you're beginning to try to find this lattice work of order of how will you measure each decision, right? Because you just mentioned probabilistic thinking, second order thinking. You threw in Occam's razor, right? Inversion from front to back. Like you've begun. Yeah, it's not going to happen overnight. I mean, it's been a year that I've been studying mental models, right? That before sharing 9, but by printing these out, and you won't need to memorize them or remember them up front, because you'll have them and say, okay, like this week on Monday, I'm going to read the Circle of Competence, or I'm going to think about thought experiment. I'm going to look for ways to run some thought experiments. I promise, like over time, they become this lattice work that we make decisions through and by, and that will make us better decision makers for sure. Yeah, I appreciate that thought of that's a lot. And as well, unpackaging little by little how we put up our lattice and begin to function with it. Julie?
Oh, there we go. Yeah, no, I love this. I love seeing the different mindsets, and it's kind of fun to see which ones are naturally that I go to, because there's obviously, as a leader, you have to make decisions quickly. Sometimes you can't sit there and overthink for 20 million years, and you just kind of snap decision, and you're always kind of like, gosh, is there a better way? And sometimes it's the proof is in the pudding, and you just have to kind of see what happens. But I love I love like the thought experiments, but not to overthink it, because sometimes I get stuck in that decision of just trying to, oh gosh, which way is the right way? And this really helps me break it down and say, okay, avoiding stupidity is easier than seeking intelligence. I love that. I love the 3 flaws. The person with the fewest blind spot wins. So really just knowing, okay, where are my blind spots in each decision that I make? And they don't have to take a long time, but also gives me some exercises to help me make those decisions quicker. So I love it. Thank you for sharing.
I think one of the wins for us as collaborators and coworkers and friends is to bring them into our conversations and challenge each other. I'll share, since I started sharing this with our teams, one of the ones that they get me on, right? Fair enough. They get me on is the map is not the territory. Like, because I'm a models guy. Like, hey, there's a model for this. Like, do it this way. And like, Chris, the map is not the territory, right? Like, the map is not, and that's good for me. It's good to get challenged on those as friends and coworkers. So even as a team working on them, it has been wildly helpful for us. So anyone else before we wrap up? Carolyn.
I really like the first principles thinking. And I think, you've mentioned going through the questions, the 5 whys, and I think more in reference with our teams. A lot of us are team leaders here, but I also think it's important that we run that question back through our own mind. Why do I think this way? What program is still running in my head that is a really old program that's not serving me anymore? And how do I look at it backwards? I love all those questions in, self-thought process.
Yeah, I actually think, thank you for bringing that up. Like, I actually think that was one of the most valuable pieces of research that I came across. I just put it in the chat so you can copy and paste it. It's the true process of Socratic thinking and those questions. Some of you wrote them down real fast. They're there. Just so that you have them, because I think you're right, Carolyn, as we personally make decisions as leaders, even before presenting that, did we go through those questions and challenge ourselves on it for sure? All right, guys, we're at the top of the hour. I hope that was helpful for us as leaders. I appreciate you showing up. We will send out some slides of this so you have them to print or use as you wish, as well as I think the recording afterwards. In the meantime, as always, if you need anything at all, just reach out. Everybody knows where to find me. So I'm here to help in any way. Thank you, guys.
Bye, guys.